The first time I heard my family laugh at my future, it wasn't a soft joke or a playful tease. It was at the reunion, under those bright white tents, surrounded by the smell of roasted corn and barbecue smoke, when someone read out the silly superlatives we all voted on every year. Everyone expected harmless categories like most likely to travel the world or most likely to become famous. But when they opened the card with my name, the entire reunion erupted with loud, cruel laughter. They had voted me most likely to end up homeless. And for a moment all I could do was stand there with my paper plate trembling in my hands, wondering how the people who were supposed to love me could think of me like that. I remember the sting of it, the way my chest tightened like I had swallowed something sharp. I saw my cousins pointing, my uncles shaking their heads, and even some of the aunties who had raised me smiling like it was all harmless fun. But it didn't feel harmless. It felt like a punch to the stomach. It felt like someone had taken everything I was struggling with, my failing job, my small paycheck, my old car that barely started, and turned it into a joke big enough for the whole family to enjoy. I tried to laugh it off, but the sound caught in my throat and all I could think was how much they underestimated me. That night I left earlier than everyone else. I sat in my car for a long time, listening to the engine wheeze, staring at the steering wheel, and trying to figure out how I became the family member people expected the least from. The truth is, I wasn't doing great. I had just lost a job. I was behind on rent. I didn't have a degree. My friends were moving forward in life and I felt stuck in the same place, tired and invisible. But hearing my own family laugh about it lit something in me that I didn't expect. It wasn't anger at them exactly, it was more like a spark that whispered, "Not anymore." That moment became a quiet promise I made to myself. A promise I never told anyone, but one that changed everything. Over the next few months, life didn't magically get better. I worked random shifts, picked up small jobs and slept very little. But every time I felt like giving up, I heard their laughter again. It pushed me in a strange way, kept me on my feet when I felt like collapsing. I started reading books on real estate, watching videos from people who built something from nothing, and slowly piecing together a new path. I didn't tell my family because I didn't want the pressure, and honestly, I didn't want their comments either. I wanted to rise quietly, even if it took years. Some nights were so hard I questioned if I was crazy for believing anything could change. But something deep inside me kept going. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was hope. Or maybe it was the memory of that reunion, the sound of everyone laughing like they already knew what my life would look like. Whatever it was, I used it like fuel. The first real break came in the most unexpected way. I was working a late shift one night when a customer I had helped earlier returned. He said he appreciated my patience and asked if I ever thought about learning a trade. I didn't know it then, but that conversation would change the next decade of my life. He introduced me to someone who owned several rental properties and needed an assistant willing to learn everything from repairs to tenant communication to the business side of real estate. I took the chance without hesitation. It didn't pay much at first, but the knowledge was priceless. I learned how to fix things, how to negotiate, how to talk to tenants, how to manage money, and eventually how to invest. I started saving little by little, cutting down on every unnecessary expense. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't fast. But it was real progress. And even though the journey was slow, every step felt like a step away from the future they imagined for me. Years went by and I built myself up piece by piece. I bought my first small property, then another. I fixed them myself when I had to, painted the walls, repaired broken steps, and learned from every mistake. Instead of giving up, I kept growing. And somewhere along the way, without even noticing, I stopped carrying the weight of their judgment. I stopped needing to prove anything. I was just focused on building the life I deserved. But the real twist, the one none of them could have predicted, happened 10 years later. 10 years after the reunion where they voted me most likely to end up homeless. 10 years after the jokes and the whispers and the pitying looks. 10 years after I walked away feeling smaller than ever. That was the year I received a call from a realtor about a property that had just gone up for sale. A property that, by chance, or maybe fate, meant more to me than any other building in the world. It was a place connected to my family. A place they never imagined I would ever own. When I signed the papers, I sat there for a long moment, staring at my name on the contract, thinking about how far I had come. It didn't feel like revenge. It felt like closure. Like the final chapter of a story they wrote for me without asking. But the real shock came later when the news reached them. When they realized that the person they once mocked, doubted, and laughed at had turned into something they never expected. The reactions were something I will never forget. Some surprised, some embarrassed, some suddenly trying to reconnect. And now here I am telling the story from a place I never thought I'd reach. A place built from struggle, mistakes, and determination. A place that proves how little people really know about the strength inside someone until it rises. But what happened next? That's the part no one in my family was ready for. Because when they finally showed up, hoping to see the life I built, they walked into something they didn't expect. Something that changed the entire dynamic forever. And that moment is where the next part of this story truly begins. When word spread through my family that I had bought the property, the same property tied so closely to our history, everything shifted. But to really understand why that moment carried so much weight, you'd have to understand everything that came before it. The story didn't start with that reunion where they mocked me. It started long before that, years before I ever realized how deeply their expectations, or the lack of them, had shaped the way I saw myself. Growing up, I wasn't the successful one in the family. Every family has those labels even if they pretend they don't. There were cousins who were called geniuses before they even learned how to drive. Others were praised as future doctors or businessmen because they got good grades or had connections. And then there was me. I was the quiet one who liked fixing things, the kid who spent more time helping neighbors repair broken fans and old bikes than studying textbooks. My teachers told me I had potential, but no one in my family seemed to agree. They were always comparing, always listing who was doing best, who was falling behind, and I was usually placed somewhere near the bottom. It wasn't that they hated me. They just didn't see much in me. That might be even worse. When a family doesn't expect anything from you, they stop paying attention to what you're capable of. I think that's why the reunion superlative hurt so much. It wasn't a random joke, it was a summary of what they had always believed. A confirmation of the low expectations they'd carried for years. But things didn't fall apart in my life because I was lazy or careless. Life just hit hard. I got a job right after high school because college wasn't an option financially. The job was fine at first, but the company downsized and I was one of the first to go. That alone would have been tough, but everything else happened around the same time. My car broke down. Rent went up. And even though I applied for job after job, nothing seemed to stick. I felt like I was slipping down a hill, no matter how hard I dug my fingers into the dirt. By the time that reunion came around, I looked like someone who had lost control of everything. And they assumed that meant I never had control to begin with. But those assumptions, those quiet labels, didn't tell the whole story. They didn't know how many nights I stayed awake planning a way out of my situation. They didn't know how badly I wanted to rewrite the future they had already mapped out for me. They didn't see that I was trying even when everything was falling apart. People see failure from the outside, but they never understand the fight happening behind the scenes. After the reunion, I started taking any work I could find. I cleaned offices at night. I stocked shelves. I fixed appliances for people who couldn't afford a professional repairman. I didn't have pride in the way some of my cousins did. I didn't care if the work wasn't glamorous or if it didn't come with a fancy title. I just cared about building something, anything, that could support the future I wanted. I didn't realize it then, but every little job was preparing me for the world of property management. Every broken sink, every cracked window, every squeaky door I repaired ended up teaching me something valuable. But the turning point came when I met the man who eventually became my mentor. He didn't care about my background or the labels attached to my name. He cared about work ethic. He cared about willingness to learn. And for the first time in a long time, someone saw potential where others saw failure. Working for him gave me a front row seat to a world I didn't even know could belong to me. I learned that real estate wasn't just for rich people with degrees and perfect credit scores. Could start with one opportunity, one break, one chance to learn. He trusted me with repairs, maintenance, and sometimes even with dealing directly with tenants. I watched how he handled problems calmly. I saw how he saved money, how he invested, how he made decisions that seemed small but added up to something huge over time. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was powerful knowledge. And while I was learning all of that, my family had no idea. To them, I was still the struggling relative who never quite figured life out. They didn't know how much I was growing. They didn't know how much I had changed. They just kept repeating that story they believed, the story where I ended up with nothing. But real change doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need applause. It happens quietly, like seeds growing under the soil long before anyone sees the leaves. During those 10 years, my relationship with my family grew distant. Not because I hated them, but because I needed space to breathe. Space to grow without the pressure of their expectations. I missed some reunions, some birthdays, some celebrations. Not because I didn't care, but because I was busy building a foundation for the life I wanted. And honestly, a part of me wasn't ready to go back until I had something to show. Something that proved their version of my story wasn't the right one. And then came the day I got the call about the property. It was a place tied to old memories, good ones and painful ones. It was a place my family had talked about for years, a place that once belonged to someone we all loved. None of us thought it would ever go on the market. And when it did, the timing felt almost too perfect. I didn't hesitate. I moved fast, signed the papers, and suddenly I was the owner of something that represented so much more than real estate. It represented a shift. A new chapter. A kind of quiet victory I could hardly explain. But buying that property didn't just change my future. It stirred something in my family. They wanted to know how I did it. They wanted to know what else I had accomplished. And some of them, the same ones who laughed the hardest, suddenly had a strange curiosity in their voices when they reached out. Not anger. Not joy. Just surprise. But their surprise was nothing compared to what happened when they actually came to visit the place. The air felt thick the moment they stepped inside. Some looked around with wide eyes. Some stayed silent. Some whispered to each other, trying to make sense of the life I had quietly built. But the real tension, the part they weren't ready for, was still ahead. Something was waiting behind that moment, something none of them expected. And I could feel it building like a slow rising wave. Because the truth was, buying the property wasn't the biggest twist. It was what came after. And that is where the next part of the story really begins. The moment my family stepped into the property, I could feel the shift in the room. There was a silence heavier than anything I had expected, the kind of silence that carries both curiosity and unspoken questions. The space smelled faintly of fresh paint, the floors polished, the windows letting in light that somehow made everything feel larger, brighter, more alive. Some of them whispered to each other, like they weren't sure if they were allowed to be impressed, or maybe they were trying to convince themselves it didn't matter. But their eyes told the truth, they weren't ready for this. I guided them from room to room, pointing out the changes I had made, the repairs I had done myself, the little touches that made the place feel like more than just a building. And I could see it, the mix of awe, confusion, and maybe even a little regret, but none of them said anything directly. Instead, they asked questions like, "How did you?" or "Where did you even start?" Questions that had no simple answers. I smiled, gave vague responses, and let them wander because I wanted them to feel it themselves before I explained anything. Behind the polite nods and cautious curiosity, I sensed tension. It wasn't just about the property. It was about the narrative of my life, the one they thought they understood. For years, they had carried this image of me as the struggling, lost relative, the one destined to fail. And now, here I was, standing in the middle of a space I had built with my own hands and decisions, a living contradiction to every joke they had ever made at my expense. But owning the property didn't erase the past. It didn't make 10 years of struggle disappear. And it didn't stop the whispers about whether I could really manage it, or if it was just a stroke of luck. Some cousins were polite, but others couldn't hide the subtle digs. One cousin, the one who had voted me most likely to end up homeless all those years ago, walked through the hall with a fake casualness, asking questions about the cost of repairs, the tenants, the bills. I knew she was testing me, trying to find a flaw, hoping to justify the old assumptions she had made. I answered calmly, but inside I felt a quiet fire. This wasn't just about proving her wrong, it was about proving myself right. The property came with tenants, and that became a whole new layer of the challenge. Some had been living there for years, others were new. Each one brought their own stories, complaints, and expectations. There were late payments, maintenance requests at odd hours, disputes between neighbors. Managing them was a different kind of test, one that no amount of financial success could fully prepare me for. I realized quickly that being a landlord wasn't just about owning property, it was about responsibility, diplomacy, and patience I hadn't needed before. And every tenant I spoke with, every problem I solved, reminded me that this success came with work that couldn't be ignored. Meanwhile, the family dynamic was shifting. Some of my relatives wanted to reconnect, perhaps out of curiosity, or maybe because they finally saw me as someone with influence and stability. Others remained distant, the same ones who had laughed at my name in that reunion superlative. Their attitude carried an edge that made interactions tense. I noticed it in subtle ways, comments that sounded supportive but carried judgment, questions that sounded innocent but were loaded with doubt. It made me realize that success doesn't just change how the world sees you, it changes how people see themselves in relation to you. Even among my closest cousins, there were different reactions. A few were genuinely happy for me, sharing memories and acknowledging how far I had come. Others couldn't hide their envy or disbelief, their words thinly veiling skepticism. One cousin, who had always struggled with finances himself, kept asking about my secrets, as if success was a cheat code instead of the result of years of hard work. I answered honestly, but the look in his eyes told me he didn't want to hear about persistence, sacrifice, or patience. He wanted a shortcut I didn't have. And then there were moments that reminded me of the family I had grown up with, the ones I hadn't seen for years or had barely spoken to. They asked about my childhood, my old neighborhood, my struggles after high school. They wanted to hear the story, but they were only halfway ready for it. Some parts made them uncomfortable, like when I described nights spent worried about rent or the fear of losing everything. I could see them squirming, shifting their weight, laughing awkwardly to cover the fact that my reality was far from the story they had told themselves. Through all of this, I began noticing patterns. Some family members only reached out when they wanted something: financial advice, a place to stay, even subtle recognition. Others stayed away entirely, perhaps out of jealousy or stubborn pride. And some, the ones I thought would never believe in me, started to watch quietly, keeping a distance, seeing my life unfold in real time without understanding the years of struggle behind it. The tension wasn't just external, it started creeping inside me as well. Managing the property, dealing with tenants, balancing family expectations, and keeping my own life moving forward created an almost invisible pressure. I realized success didn't erase the past, it layered it with new responsibilities. And sometimes, the weight of others' expectations felt heavier than the years of struggle that came before. Then came the unexpected messages. Some relatives started texting me late at night, asking for help, guidance, or even small loans. Others showed up at the property unannounced, offering apologies they couldn't quite complete. Every interaction carried an underlying question. Can you really handle this life? Can you maintain what you've built? And every time, I reminded myself that the answers weren't simple, and some tensions were better observed than confronted immediately. Even as I navigated this world, I noticed small victories, moments of pride. A tenant called to thank me for fixing an issue quickly. A cousin smiled sincerely, not out of obligation but genuine admiration. But those moments were always tinged with the tension of unresolved questions. Could I maintain the property long-term? Would the family's skepticism fade completely, or was it something that would linger forever? And most importantly, could I balance the success I had built with the relationships that had been strained, even broken, over years of misunderstanding? And that's where the story was really at its most fragile. The property represented more than just financial success. It was a symbol, a challenge, and a battleground for past grievances, unspoken doubts, and lingering judgment. Every interaction with my family, every tenant issue, every late-night phone call added a layer of suspense to a story that wasn't finished. Because the truth is, while I had achieved what they once thought impossible, the conflict had only just begun. And what happened next would test not just my business skills, but my patience, my relationships, and my ability to stay true to the life I had built without letting the past define me. The tension was rising, and I could feel it like static in the air. Something was waiting just around the corner, something that could change everything. And as much as I wanted to see how it would unfold, I knew that part of the story wasn't ready to be revealed yet. The tension in the property grew stronger with each passing week. Every interaction with my family seemed to carry a hidden layer, as if they were all waiting for me to slip, to make one mistake that would justify the story they had told themselves for years. I could feel it in the way my cousin, who had once voted me most likely to end up homeless, lingered in the hallways longer than necessary, pretending to admire a fixture or a painting, while her eyes scanned every detail, looking for flaws. I had learned to stay calm, to smile and nod, but inside, a quiet storm was building. The tenants added another layer of pressure. Some were genuinely difficult, complaints that seemed small but escalated into arguments, requests that arrived at odd hours, issues with neighbors that no one could predict. Every day it felt like I was juggling fragile glass. One misstep could shatter everything I had worked so hard to build. And I knew that if word got back to my family about any mishap, it would feed their old assumptions. I wasn't just managing a property, I was managing perceptions, expectations, and the fragile egos of everyone around me. At the same time, old wounds with family members resurfaced. There were conversations that started politely and ended with subtle accusations or reminders of my past struggles. One evening, during a family dinner at the property, someone casually mentioned how surprised they were that I actually managed to make it work. The words were coated with sarcasm, but the meaning was clear. They were still measuring my worth against the version of me they had always assumed. I started noticing alliances forming subtly among my relatives. Some were quietly rooting for me, offering help and advice, even if they weren't vocal about it. Others were more cautious, observing every move I made, calculating how my success might reflect on them or shift the family dynamics. It felt like walking a tightrope where every step mattered. One wrong move and not only could I face criticism, but the delicate balance of relationships could tilt entirely. Amid all of this, there were personal challenges I hadn't anticipated. Managing the property and maintaining my own life meant late nights, endless paperwork, and constant decision-making. My phone buzzed incessantly with tenant issues, maintenance problems, or family inquiries. I began losing track of time, realizing that success wasn't just about owning something, it was about sustaining it, and that was far more exhausting than anyone had told me. Every day was a test of endurance, patience, and judgment. And then came the subtle threats, the ones that weren't spoken aloud but hung in the air like a storm cloud. A few relatives, the ones who had once been dismissive, started hinting that they might need something from me: loans, favors, even opportunities. I sensed that some were looking for a chance to test my generosity, to see if I would falter under the weight of expectations. Every time I considered helping, I hesitated. Could I give without losing control? Could I trust that it wouldn't backfire? The questions gnawed at me, leaving me restless at night. The building itself seemed to carry the suspense. Minor problems became major stressors, each repair or dispute a reminder that control was fragile. One morning, a pipe burst in the basement. Water poured everywhere, threatening damage to tenants' apartments. I raced to manage it, contacting plumbers, moving personal items, calming tenants who were on the verge of panic. By the time the crisis was under control, I was exhausted, my hands raw from work, my mind spinning with what-ifs. And as I surveyed the damage, I realized this property, my symbol of success, was also a constant test, a reflection of every obstacle I had faced over the last decade. Then there were moments that hit harder than anything else. Whispers I caught in the hallways, hushed conversations that stopped when I entered the room, the subtle exchange of looks between relatives that said more than words ever could. I began to feel like my every move was under a microscope. Success had brought visibility, but with it came scrutiny I hadn't experienced before. And the stakes weren't just financial, they were deeply personal. Every success was measured against my past, every small misstep amplified in the eyes of my family. As weeks turned into months, the tension reached a point where it felt almost unbearable. My family's expectations, the tenants' demands, and the weight of my own ambitions collided, creating a pressure that seemed ready to explode. Late one night, after dealing with a series of complaints and minor crises, I sat alone in the office of the property, staring at the ledger, the emails, the maintenance requests, and the messages from family members. The silence was heavy, almost suffocating. I realized then that the real challenge wasn't just managing the property, it was managing the storm I had walked into, one that involved my family, my past, and the life I was building. And just when I thought the pressure couldn't rise any higher, an unexpected message arrived. It was from the cousin who had laughed the loudest at that reunion superlative, the one who had once made me feel like my future was already written in failure. The tone was vague but pointed. She wanted to meet, alone. The words carried a weight I couldn't ignore, a tension that hinted at confrontation, revelation, or maybe something far more unpredictable. I felt a mix of anticipation and dread. Every instinct told me that this meeting could be a turning point, the moment where everything I had worked for collided with the past in a way that could either break me or change everything. I thought about the years of struggle, the nights of doubt, the quiet victories no one had seen. I thought about how far I had come and yet how fragile it all still felt. As I prepared for that encounter, I couldn't shake the sense that the climax of my story was approaching. The moment where all the unresolved tension, the family expectations, the struggles with tenants, and the personal battles would converge. Every detail, every challenge, every quiet victory had led to this point, and I knew that what happened next could shift everything in ways I hadn't imagined. The night before the meeting, I barely slept. I paced the property, checking locks, reviewing plans, and replaying past conversations in my mind. The anticipation was almost unbearable, a mix of fear, excitement, and uncertainty that made my heart race. I understood, more than ever, that success wasn't just about owning property or proving people wrong, it was about facing the people who had doubted you and confronting the past head-on. And so, with the morning light creeping through the windows, I knew the moment was coming. The confrontation, the test, the reckoning with the family that once labeled me, most likely to end up homeless, was inevitable. I didn't know what would happen, but I knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever feel the same after this. The storm was about to break, and I could only brace myself for what came next. The morning of the meeting arrived with a strange, heavy quiet. The property felt different that day, almost like it was holding its breath along with me. The tenants were unusually subdued, the usual hum of daily life replaced by a tense stillness. I could feel it in the walls, in the creak of the floorboards, like the entire place sensed the storm that was about to hit. I tried to focus on practical matters. checking maintenance schedules, reviewing tenant files, but my mind kept drifting back to that message from my cousin. Something about it didn't feel ordinary. Something felt deliberate. When she arrived, she didn't knock. She walked straight in, a faint smile masking eyes that were sharper than ever. I could tell she had rehearsed her approach, choosing words carefully, choosing how to position herself. But before she could speak, she dropped something on the table, a thick envelope with my name scrawled across it. I froze. It wasn't the casual request or apology I had half expected. It was heavier than that, almost foreboding. "I thought you should see this," she said, her tone casual but with an edge that made my stomach tighten. "It's connected to the property. Something I found while going through old family papers." I opened the envelope slowly, my hands trembling slightly. Inside were documents I didn't fully understand at first glance. Legal papers, a deed, and what looked like a note from a lawyer years ago. As I scanned the pages, my heart sank. The documents hinted at a potential claim to the property by someone I had never met, someone distant from the family but with a legitimate legal angle. It was as if a hidden chapter of my family's past had been quietly waiting to surface, and now it threatened everything I had worked for. The shock wasn't just in the documents, it was in the timing. Everything had been stable, everything had seemed within my control, and now, out of nowhere, a new threat emerged. I could feel my mind racing. Could this cousin have intentionally found these papers? Or was it an accident, a coincidence too perfect to be true? And more importantly, who else knew about this? Her presence made the moment even more intense. She watched me closely, her gaze a mix of curiosity and something I couldn't quite read. Was it concern, or was it satisfaction at seeing me caught off guard? The way she stood there, waiting for my reaction, added a layer of psychological tension that was almost unbearable. I realized that this confrontation wasn't just about family dynamics anymore. It was about a challenge that could topple the fragile empire I had built, or at least shake its foundations. As I sifted through the documents, more questions surfaced. The legal language hinted that if I didn't act quickly, someone could contest my ownership. The timelines were tight, the loopholes complicated, and the potential damage catastrophic. Suddenly, all the late nights, all the hard work, all the quiet victories felt like they could vanish in a single moment. And that realization made the stakes feel higher than ever. At that moment, another layer of conflict emerged. One of the tenants, who had been quiet during previous meetings, suddenly appeared in the doorway, holding a notice that had arrived in the mail earlier that morning. It was a complaint from a neighboring property owner, citing some technical issue that, if left unresolved, could lead to fines or legal trouble. It wasn't an insurmountable problem, but the timing couldn't have been worse. The property, my symbol of triumph over doubt, suddenly felt like a battlefield from every direction. I looked at my cousin, unsure if I could trust her completely. Was she bringing this up because she genuinely wanted to help, or was this another test? The family tension, the tenant disputes, the hidden legal threat, it all collided at once, and the weight of it pressed down on me like never before. I realized that this wasn't just a story about proving my family wrong anymore. It had evolved into something much bigger, something that required careful thinking, strategy, and courage I wasn't sure I had fully tapped into yet. The envelope sat on the table like a ticking clock. I could almost feel it counting down, daring me to make a move, daring me to falter. The property, the tenants, my family, all the pieces were in place and the tension was unbearable. And then, just as I thought the moment couldn't get any more intense, my phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number, short and cryptic. "We know what you did. Be careful." I froze, my pulse spiking. The message didn't clarify anything, but it implied a threat that went beyond family drama or property disputes. Someone outside the family, someone who had been watching quietly, had noticed the change in my life. My past struggles, my rise, and now my property, it had attracted attention I hadn't anticipated. And just like that, the story I had been living was no longer just about family judgments or tenant disputes. It was about survival, secrecy, and protecting what I had built from forces I didn't yet understand. I looked back at my cousin, the envelope, and the stack of documents. Every instinct screamed that I was standing on the edge of something huge, something that could either cement my success forever or unravel it completely. The tension was unbearable. The property, once my quiet victory, had turned into a crucible of hidden threats, family tension, and unexpected challenges. I realized, with a chill, that nothing I had done in the last 10 years could fully prepare me for what was coming. And yet there was no turning back. Every choice, every action, every conversation from this moment forward would matter in ways I hadn't yet imagined. The climax of my story was approaching, and I could feel it closing in like a storm ready to break. And in that moment, with the envelope on the table, the mysterious message on my phone, and my cousin's unreadable expression, I knew one thing for certain. The life I had built was about to be tested in ways I never saw coming, and the outcome was far from certain. When word spread through my family that I had bought the property, the same property tied so closely to our history, everything shifted. But to really understand why that moment carried so much weight, you'd have to understand everything that came before it. The story didn't start with that reunion where they mocked me. It started long before that, years before I ever realized how deeply their expectations, or the lack of them, had shaped the way I saw myself. Growing up, I wasn't the successful one in the family. Every family has those labels even if they pretend they don't. There were cousins who were called geniuses before they even learned how to drive. Others were praised as future doctors or businessmen because they got good grades or had connections. And then there was me. I was the quiet one who liked fixing things, the kid who spent more time helping neighbors repair broken fans and old bikes than studying textbooks. My teachers told me I had potential, but no one in my family seemed to agree. They were always comparing, always listing who was doing best, who was falling behind, and I was usually placed somewhere near the bottom. It wasn't that they hated me. They just didn't see much in me. That might be even worse. When a family doesn't expect anything from you, they stop paying attention to what you're capable of. I think that's why the reunion superlative hurt so much. It wasn't a random joke, it was a summary of what they had always believed. A confirmation of the low expectations they'd carried for years. But things didn't fall apart in my life because I was lazy or careless. Life just hit hard. I got a job right after high school because college wasn't an option financially. The job was fine at first, but the company downsized and I was one of the first to go. That alone would have been tough, but everything else happened around the same time. My car broke down. Rent went up. And even though I applied for job after job, nothing seemed to stick. I felt like I was slipping down a hill, no matter how hard I dug my fingers into the dirt. By the time that reunion came around, I looked like someone who had lost control of everything. And they assumed that meant I never had control to begin with. But those assumptions, those quiet labels, didn't tell the whole story. They didn't know how many nights I stayed awake planning a way out of my situation. They didn't know how badly I wanted to rewrite the future they had already mapped out for me. They didn't see that I was trying even when everything was falling apart. People see failure from the outside, but they never understand the fight happening behind the scenes. After the reunion, I started taking any work I could find. I cleaned offices at night. I stocked shelves. I fixed appliances for people who couldn't afford a professional repairman. I didn't have pride in the way some of my cousins did. I didn't care if the work wasn't glamorous or if it didn't come with a fancy title. I just cared about building something, anything, that could support the future I wanted. I didn't realize it then, but every little job was preparing me for the world of property management. Every broken sink, every cracked window, every squeaky door I repaired ended up teaching me something valuable. But the turning point came when I met the man who eventually became my mentor. He didn't care about my background or the labels attached to my name. He cared about work ethic. He cared about willingness to learn. And for the first time in a long time, someone saw potential where others saw failure. Working for him gave me a front row seat to a world I didn't even know could belong to me. I learned that real estate wasn't just for rich people with degrees and perfect credit scores. Could start with one opportunity, one break, one chance to learn. He trusted me with repairs, maintenance, and sometimes even with dealing directly with tenants. I watched how he handled problems calmly. I saw how he saved money, how he invested, how he made decisions that seemed small but added up to something huge over time. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was powerful knowledge. And while I was learning all of that, my family had no idea. To them, I was still the struggling relative who never quite figured life out. They didn't know how much I was growing. They didn't know how much I had changed. They just kept repeating that story they believed, the story where I ended up with nothing. But real change doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need applause. It happens quietly, like seeds growing under the soil long before anyone sees the leaves. During those 10 years, my relationship with my family grew distant. Not because I hated them, but because I needed space to breathe. Space to grow without the pressure of their expectations. I missed some reunions, some birthdays, some celebrations. Not because I didn't care, but because I was busy building a foundation for the life I wanted. And honestly, a part of me wasn't ready to go back until I had something to show. Something that proved their version of my story wasn't the right one. And then came the day I got the call about the property. It was a place tied to old memories, good ones and painful ones. It was a place my family had talked about for years, a place that once belonged to someone we all loved. None of us thought it would ever go on the market. And when it did, the timing felt almost too perfect. I didn't hesitate. I moved fast, signed the papers, and suddenly I was the owner of something that represented so much more than real estate. It represented a shift. A new chapter. A kind of quiet victory I could hardly explain. But buying that property didn't just change my future. It stirred something in my family. They wanted to know how I did it. They wanted to know what else I had accomplished. And some of them, the same ones who laughed the hardest, suddenly had a strange curiosity in their voices when they reached out. Not anger. Not joy. Just surprise. But their surprise was nothing compared to what happened when they actually came to visit the place. The air felt thick the moment they stepped inside. Some looked around with wide eyes. Some stayed silent. Some whispered to each other, trying to make sense of the life I had quietly built. But the real tension, the part they weren't ready for, was still ahead. Something was waiting behind that moment, something none of them expected. And I could feel it building like a slow, rising wave. Because the truth was, buying the property wasn't the biggest twist. It was what came after. And that is where the next part of the story really begins. The days after their visit were some of the most intense I had ever experienced. It wasn't just the family's surprise or curiosity, it was the way the property itself seemed to hold a secret, something lingering just beneath the surface. I started noticing little things that didn't make sense. A tenant who seemed unusually nervous when I asked routine questions, a delivery note that had been misplaced, small repairs that appeared to have been tampered with. At first, I told myself it was just coincidence, that I was imagining pressure where there was none. But slowly, a pattern began to emerge, one that made my stomach tighten every time I thought about it. Then came the phone call that made my heart stop. The voice on the other end was calm, almost eerily composed, but the words carried an unmistakable edge. "We know about the property. We know what it means to you. Be careful who you trust." That was all. No name. No explanation. Just a warning that made the hair on my arms stand on end. I had faced tough tenants, skeptical family members, even the financial risks of buying the place. But this was something different. This felt like a threat from the shadows, a reminder that even success had enemies I couldn't see. The next family gathering pushed the tension even further. Some relatives were clearly trying to connect, asking about tenants, repairs, even tips on investing. But there were others who lingered in corners, whispering just out of earshot, casting glances that made me feel like I was being tested at every turn. One cousin, the same one who voted me most likely to end up homeless all those years ago, began asking unusually pointed questions about finances, management, and legal documents. She sounded casual, but every word was loaded, and I could sense a curiosity that was anything but innocent. Meanwhile, the property itself began to feel like a pressure cooker. Minor tenant disputes escalated, repairs popped up faster than I could manage, and I started receiving legal notices I hadn't expected. Some from past owners, some from neighboring properties claiming encroachment or zoning issues. Each notice felt like another piece of a puzzle designed to destabilize me, to see if I could withstand the pressure. And the more I solved, the more it became clear that the challenges weren't random. They were testing me deliberately in ways I couldn't yet understand. The real twist came when I discovered something hidden in the property's old storage room. A set of documents that didn't match anything I had seen before. They were older than I realized, some handwritten, some typed, detailing agreements, debts, and even promises that no one had mentioned. One sheet in particular caught my eye. It suggested that part of the property might legally belong to a distant relative who had never surfaced before. Suddenly, what I thought was secure, what I had built with sweat and determination, was vulnerable to forces from the past I had never known existed. I felt a mix of disbelief and anger. Could my own family have hidden this from me, or had I simply never known? Was this another obstacle thrown in my path to test my resolve? And most importantly, how far were they, or anyone else, willing to go to challenge the life I had painstakingly constructed? That evening, I called the cousin who had first warned me about potential claims. She hesitated at first, then finally admitted she had found something unusual while sorting through old family archives. "I didn't know if I should tell you," she said quietly. "But I thought you deserved to know, before anyone else tried to use it against you." The words were meant to be helpful, but all I could feel was the weight of an impending storm. As the sun set over the property, the air seemed thicker, almost oppressive. Tenants were quiet, family members were distant, and I felt a pressure building inside me that I had never experienced before. Everything I had worked for, every late night, every repair, every moment I had spent proving myself, was about to collide with forces I didn't fully understand. And I knew deep down that the real test of my journey was only just beginning. The property that had once been my quiet victory had transformed into a battleground. Secrets from the past, hidden claims, suspicious family members, and unseen threats all converged in a way that left me uncertain who I could trust. Every call, every document, every conversation carried the weight of potential disaster. The life I had built was at a tipping point, and one wrong move could unravel everything. And yet, despite the fear, I felt a strange clarity. This was the moment I had been preparing for without even knowing it, the moment where patience, resilience, and determination would be tested like never before. The tension was unbearable, the stakes higher than ever, and the next twist could change everything. I didn't know how it would end. I only knew that the property, my family, and my past were about to collide in a way that would define everything I had fought to build. And standing in the quiet of the property, surrounded by the evidence of both triumph and threat, I realized that the climax of my story was closer than I had ever imagined. The storm that had been building for weeks finally broke in a way I never expected. That distant relative, the one whose claim had surfaced in the hidden documents, appeared at the property one morning. I had prepared for confrontation, imagined arguments and legal battles, even tension that could last months. But when they walked in, there was no anger, no accusation, just surprise and, strangely, a sense of connection. They were family, distant but real, and they had no idea that the property had been in someone else's hands for years, managed carefully, maintained with dedication. We sat down together in the living room, the envelope of old documents between us. I explained everything, the purchase, the tenants, the challenges, the years of work behind it. I shared the story no one in my family had known, the struggle, the doubts, the nights I had spent thinking I'd never get ahead. I watched as their expression shifted, from suspicion to understanding and finally to admiration. They didn't need to take legal action, they weren't looking for conflict. They just wanted recognition that I had done something remarkable. That meeting changed everything. The tension I had carried with my family, the invisible weight of expectations and assumptions, began to lift. Some relatives reached out, asking questions, apologizing for their doubts, even offering support in ways I hadn't expected. The ones who had once laughed at the idea of my success began to see that what I had built wasn't luck. It was effort, patience, resilience, and a refusal to let others define my potential. At the same time, I worked through the challenges with tenants and maintenance. Every repair, every late-night phone call, every negotiation with tenants that had once felt overwhelming now seemed manageable. The knowledge I had accumulated over the years became a source of confidence rather than stress. I could see progress in every corner of the property, the freshly painted walls, the functioning plumbing, the smiles of tenants who appreciated the effort I had put in. What once felt like a battleground became a home for everyone who lived there, a space of stability, growth, and respect. There were still difficult conversations with family members, and some relationships remained strained. But I learned that not every conflict needed to be resolved immediately, that sometimes success speaks louder than words. The property had become a living testament to perseverance, a symbol not just of financial stability but of personal growth. And I realized that the greatest victories often come quietly, in ways that aren't always visible to those around you. Looking back, I understood that being voted most likely to end up homeless had been a turning point, even if it had felt cruel at the time. That moment of mockery lit a fire within me, a determination to rewrite my story and prove to myself that my life was not defined by others' expectations. Every setback, every challenge, every sleepless night had led me to the place I stood now, a place of ownership, of responsibility, and of quiet pride. The distant relative's presence also brought an unexpected sense of closure. We worked together to review all the legal aspects, ensuring that the property's ownership was secure and that future conflicts could be avoided. It was a collaborative process that emphasized family, trust, and respect, and it reminded me that even the most complicated situations can be resolved with honesty and patience. I learned that the past, no matter how messy or challenging, can be acknowledged without letting it control your present. My family's perception of me began to shift in a way that felt almost surreal. The cousins who had doubted me started asking for advice on finances, property management, and even career decisions. The ones who had dismissed me started showing genuine interest in my life, not because they were compelled to, but because they had finally witnessed the dedication and persistence behind my accomplishments. That recognition, however, was never my goal. What mattered was the personal growth I had achieved, the knowledge that I could build a life on my own terms despite the doubts, criticisms, or laughter of others. The tenants became a part of this new chapter as well. Some stayed on as long-term renters, appreciating the care and attention I brought to managing the property. Others moved on, leaving behind stories and memories of challenges overcome and solutions found. I realized that being a landlord was more than collecting rent or managing repairs. It was about creating a space where people could feel secure, respected, and heard. That sense of purpose, of making a tangible difference in the lives of others, became one of the most rewarding aspects of my success. As the months passed, the property became a hub for connection. Family gatherings were held there, not as competitions or judgments, but as celebrations of shared history and growth. I could see the same space that had once been a source of tension and uncertainty now filled with laughter, conversation, and moments of genuine connection. It was a reminder that time, patience, and persistence can transform even the most challenging situations into opportunities for healing and understanding. Looking back over the decades since that fateful reunion, I realized how much had changed, not just in my life but in the way I saw myself. I had gone from someone underestimated, doubted, and laughed at to someone who could take control of my own destiny. The property was more than a building. It was proof that resilience, focus, and determination can overcome the low expectations of others. And I had learned that success is not measured by the recognition you receive, but by the challenges you overcome and the growth you achieve along the way. There were still lessons to carry forward. Family relationships required ongoing effort, communication, and understanding. Tenants would always have needs and concerns that demanded attention. But I approached each challenge with confidence, knowing that the foundation I had built, through years of work, persistence, and quiet determination, was solid. The property had become a symbol of everything I had achieved, a reminder that the path to success is rarely straight, often difficult, but always possible if you refuse to give up.